of this conference, which focuses on the implications of technology-enabled disruption on labor market. So the speakers will discuss the effect of disruption on labor arrangements, the rise of the so-called gig economy. They will also discuss to what extent technological change has led to the elimination of certain types of jobs, and whether there's a future for routine jobs. So I think it ties in very, very closely with some of the topics that have been discussed in earlier sessions today. But we'll really dive in some of the implications for labor market. And I'm really pleased to be joined by three outstanding and prominent research economists here who have thought very deeply and written extensively about these issues. So first, to my left, Katharine Abraham. She's professor of economics and professor of survey methodology at the University of Maryland. She is also the director of the Maryland Center for Economic Policy. So you have the full bio of her in your booklet, but just I wanted to emphasize the fact that she has published extensively on issues related to the labor market, on also the quality of jobs, and just over the past year, I guess she has written a couple of fascinating papers attempting to explain the decline of the U.S. employment to population ratio, as well as the rise of the gig economy. And she has also separately worked on a number of issues related to measurements and you know, that part of her interest, I suppose, related to the fact that she has also served as commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics from 1993 to 2001, and as a member of the Council of Economic Advisors from 2011 to 2013. So it's really my pleasure to welcome Katharine Abraham to this panel. Next, to her left, Ekkehard Ernst is chief macroeconomist at the International Labour Organization, which is based in Geneva, Switzerland, my hometown. He is responsible for understanding the future of work and analyzing jobs and earnings around the globe. So they take very much an international perspective, and it's going to be of great interest to us here to hear about his experience looking at the problems from a global perspective. So before joining the ILO in 2008, he worked at the OECD, so the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, as well as at the European Central Bank. So he has also published extensively on labor market issues, labor market trends, and the impact of financial markets and technology, artificial intelligence on jobs. And finally, at the very end of the table here, Henry Hsu. He's professor of economics at the University of British Columbia, has done extensive research on macroeconomics and labor economics as well, has done fascinating work on automation, on job polarization, on the decline of the middle class jobs, and also the effect on recessions and jobless recoveries. So the way we were going to proceed here is similar to what the other panels have done. We'll have each one of them give a presentation. We'll start with Henry Hsu. He's going to discuss technological change and automation. We'll then proceed with Ekkehard, talking about the international dimensions of the effect of technological change on labor market, and then finish with Katharine Abraham, who will discuss how technology is affecting the way the work is being organized and to what extent we see a rise in the so-called gig economy. So thank you for welcoming all this panel, and with you, let's start with Henry on the left with his presentation.
Thank you so much, Mark. Thank you for having me at this wonderful conference. I'm going to speak to you today about labor market disruption, and in particular, the impact of automation on the labor market. Much of what I've had to say, I mean, we've covered already in the earlier sessions today. So what I'm going to try to do is I'm going to try to bring it all together and synthesize it and kind of lay the groundwork for how to think about what's going to happen in the near future, and talk a little bit about policy implications, and that's going to come up as we move down the panel. So to start, you know, I think that this cover article from the Atlantic magazine from a few years back kind of really summarizes the psychology of the public discourse around technological change and the future of work rather than a picture that you might get from watching the Jetsons cartoon at lunch growing up. It's a much more dystopic view of the future. This cover image looks like it may have come out of Cormac McCarthy's The Road or something like that. So it's really a view that, what's going to happen to us as technology advances. So I think to give us some perspective, I'd like to kind of think back in time. I want you to think back to the turn of the century when we saw a real breakthrough in terms of automotive technology. This was going to be a vehicle with a brand new engine, a brand new fuel source. It meant that we'd be able to travel at much faster speeds, ludicrous speeds. It was an engine with more torque, more horsepower. And it was really going to transform the way that we get around. For those of you who maybe have kind of thought forward, the turn of the century I'm talking about is not the one that happened 20 years ago. It's the one that happened at the turn of the 20th century, and which brought about the second industrial revolution. And what we saw, 120 years ago was, a real change in the way that we produce things. We moved to the mass production system. We saw the seedings of electrification throughout the nation, and obviously the internal combustion engine. This was, a radical innovation that really, put to end the use of the horse and buggy. Okay, so I think this example from history helps us to understand, what technology does in terms of the labor market. I think there are three important lessons to take from this. Technological progress is human progress. It replaces the drudgery of human work with animals and machines. I think the second important lesson to take away from this example is the fact that technological progress's effects on the labor market, especially in the short run, its effects are uneven. There are winners and losers whenever there's technological change. In my example that I just showed you, the obvious loser was the horse, which was essentially eliminated from the American workplace. And of course, the third important lesson from this example is the fact that humans are not horses. And while I showed this slide jokingly, I'm going to come back to this later in the discussion. So but what my work focuses on is the implications of the current wave of technological change on the labor market. And this is what I'm going to refer to as automation. So the way to think about automation today is it too has uneven effects in terms of who wins and who loses as automation progresses. And the way to think about this, I think, is useful to delineate the types of work we do, occupations, along two dimensions. The first dimension is whether a job is cognitive or manual, in other words, whether it's more brain versus brawn. And the other important dimension to delineate occupations is as to whether it is routine or, because economists are very good with words, whether it's routine or non-routine. And in particular, what's happened with today's automation, it has had a disproportionately negative effect on occupations that are routine. So routine occupations, we've actually seen this word brought up earlier today without a specific definition, so the definition I'm going to give to it is an occupation is routine if it involves a relatively limited set of tasks to be done on the job, and whether those tasks can be performed by following a relatively well set out set of instructions or rules. The opposite then would be non-routine occupations. Rather than a limited set of tasks, in that job you perform a wider variety of things, and performing those tasks requires some sort of flexibility, either mental flexibility or physical flexibility, some problem solving, some discretion, and typically some human interaction. So here's those two dimensions of occupational classification broken down into four groups. You have the non-routine jobs listed there at the top as the non-routine cognitive jobs. These would be what we would think of as typically white-collar jobs. At the bottom there, I've listed the other classification of non-routine jobs. Those would be the non-routine manual jobs, for instance, waiter, groundskeeper, manicurist, and, in terms of big employment growth occupations, home health aides and personal care aides. And I've listed the routine jobs. I've listed them in the middle. Let me come back to why I put them in the middle just shortly. But in terms of Routine jobs, there's two categories of routine jobs, routine manual and routine cognitive jobs. It's probably going to be obvious to you what those are. These are the jobs that have been more or less disappearing. So the classic routine manual job would be a production worker on the factory floor. So beer bottling plants in Milwaukee don't look like this anymore. Automotive plants in Michigan have many fewer people on the production line. They look much more like this, where I do not see any human beings in this photo that I've chosen. So that's a classic example of routine manual work. The classic examples of routine cognitive work, and really the disappearance of these jobs, employment in these jobs, has had a much wider effect on the US economy, because routine cognitive jobs don't exist just in manufacturing. They exist in every sector, in every industry of the economy. So while we're doing much more data entry, bookkeeping, organizational and scheduling work today than we did 50 years ago, we just do it with a lot fewer people and more gadgets. So the routine occupations then are the routine manual ones there, and the routine cognitive ones listed there. So to give you like a graphic as to how this has played out in the US economy over the past 35, 40 years, here's a bar graph showing of all of the work, of all of the employment being done in the different occupations in the US economy, how has that share changed from the 1980s to today? And what you can see is that while the share of employment in the non-routine cognitive and the non-routine manual jobs has been growing, and then in the non-routine manual jobs that's been especially strong over the past 20 years, there's been this disappearance of employment in the routine jobs. And this is showing you how those occupational groups have changed relative to total employment. But this is not just representing the fact that all of the employment growth is in the non-routine jobs with steady employment in the routine jobs. What's actually happened is that routine employment relative to the US population, that's actually been falling over time. Let's see if we can bring it back. But yeah, you saw that pattern of disappearance of employment in routine occupations. And the other thing that I think someone used the word whether things were stable, or like whether things changed smoothly, or whether it in punctuated bursts was a phrase that I saw earlier. You saw in that graph that the loss of these routine jobs, those happen in punctuated bursts that we refer to as recessions. Are the slides back up? Not quite yet. Okay. The other thing to say, and I think that Ekkehard is going to discuss next, is the fact that this is a graphic that's relevant for the U.S. economy, but this is happening essentially throughout the industrialized world in all OECD countries. Let me now get back to the fact that I listed. Oh, I gave it away, but it doesn't really matter. I listed those routine occupations kind of in the middle of that slide. So this is a screenshot that I took from the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Outlook Handbook. It lists hundreds, thousands of different occupations that we have in the US economy. Here's an example of a routine manual occupation, metal and plastic machine workers. And the thing that I want to draw your attention to are the top two lines in the summary, how much the median full-time worker, machine worker, earned in 2016, and how much education is required to obtain that type of a job. You see that this is a job that pays a squarely middle-class salary, requiring no more than secondary education, typically, okay? So there's a routine manual occupation. Here, travel agent. Here's a typical routine cognitive occupation or routine office occupation. Again, a squarely middle-class salary with not, crazy educational requirements in the job. So this idea of this decline of employment in routine occupations, in economics refer to this as job polarization, because what's happening is that all of the job growth that we see in the US economy, not all, most of the job growth that we see in the US economy is happening at the north and south pole of the wage distribution. We get this hollowing out of the middle. This is the phenomenon of the disappearance of the middle class. And obviously it's a contributing factor. It's not the only factor, but it's a contributing factor to the widening income inequality that we see within the US economy, within Canada, within Britain, and other industrialized economies. One thing that I do want to point out, of course, is that this is the current wave of technological progress that we see right now, what I would refer to as industrial robotics and automation. This has led to greater inequality in the US currently, but there is no economic axiom that says that technological progress leads to greater inequality. In the same way, there's no economic axiom that says that technological progress lifts all boats, leaving nobody behind. That simply isn't true. And so while we are currently seeing technological advance that is contributing to inequality, there's good reason to think that the next wave of technological advance may do the opposite. Again, going back to the second industrial revolution, the advent of the factory line, Henry Ford's production system, what that really did was an equalizing technological advance. It allowed the manufacture of automobiles to go from something that was performed by a small number of highly skilled and therefore highly paid artisans to something that could be done by individuals with less skill, and it allowed what was otherwise the economically marginalized individuals of the U.S. population, largely immigrants of European descent. It allowed for them to become the producers of automobile, and of course they filled the ranks of the storied American middle class throughout the 20th century that is now in decline. So again, the idea that technological progress may lead to greater inequality, may lead to less inequality, that depends from time, that'll vary from time to time. So moving forward as to, these individuals who would have been working in routine occupations, or if they had lived 40 years ago, what are they doing now? This is a question, obviously, that we are very concerned about. In work with my co-authors, again, we point out the fact that those who work in routine occupations tend to have lower levels of educational attainment. Men, who tend to work in routine manual occupations, statistically, distributionally speaking, and women in routine cognitive occupations, what are happening to these individuals? So in work that we've laid out elsewhere, I'm just going to pull from that work here. What's happening to American men? These are prime-aged American men who have at most a high school education. As we've said, the chances that they're working in one of these routine manual occupations, that's fallen from 1979 to 2014. It's fallen by about 20%. So the chances that they're working in these relatively well-paid jobs has gone down. What are they doing instead? Well, some of them are working in other jobs, working in typically lower-paying jobs, but the vast majority of them are just spending less of their time working at all. They're much more likely to be out of the labor force. This decline of employment opportunities in these routine occupations, from a purely accounting sense, it helps to account for much of the fall in U.S. labor force participation among working-aged men, especially the young men. This is not necessarily the case for routine women. Routine women, what's actually happening is that they tend to be obtaining more education than before, and they are moving up the occupational ladder into better jobs. And so, so this job polarization phenomenon accounts for prime-age labor force dynamics in the U.S. And it's interesting to note that at least over the past 20 years, this is concurrent, just from a timing perspective, in terms of what we've seen in terms of rising disability claims, pain medication use, and I like this term, the use of the recreational computer usage amongst prime-age men. This is video gaming. And there are papers who have kind of gone on to talk about the fact that, well, if the labor market value of these men has been falling over time, that's going to have implications for broader phenomena outside of the labor force in terms of family structure and what's going to happen to the next generation of American men and women. All right, so now let me kind of talk a little bit about what I think is likely going to be happening in the near-term future, the next 5 to 10 years. this prescription that, we likely, that I received and that, we've given to our children is, don't worry, just go to university, you'll get a great job, everything will be fine, is simply increasing educational attainment enough? There's economic analysis that's been done that says, well, at least over the past 20 years, that prescription may not be enough because the increasing supply of high-skilled workers, of college-educated workers, seems to be outstripping the increasing demand for workers in these occupations nowadays. And in terms of what's next in terms of future automation, as was discussed before, this is going to come in the form of neural networking, machine learning, in the form of advanced robotics. I'm thinking about autonomous vehicles, as has already been mentioned, but also in terms of 3D printing. There's already evidence that these innovations are already being seen in the current workplace in fields that used to be more insulated from its effects. We're seeing the effects of automation now in the more complex or non-routine occupations. You see it in the legal profession, you see it in medicine. And so again, the idea that certain jobs are insulated or immune from these technological advances, that's not necessarily going to be the case. Technological progress is going to creep into those areas. I think what's important to remember, as the economic historians have already brought up in the past, is that while technological progress takes away job opportunities in some occupations, it creates whole new job opportunities that we cannot imagine sitting here in 2019, whole new occupations. And the other thing that's true, and this is more subtle, is the fact that, as technological progress, as automation and machine learning and artificial intelligence creeps into non-routine occupations, it's not necessarily going to wipe those jobs out, in large part because non-routine occupations, like I said before, involves the performance of a much wider variety of tasks. So while some tasks in my non-routine job may be digitized or automated away, it'll allow me to evolve and shift my time and efforts to the other tasks in my job. There is greater scope for evolution or reallocation or reshuffling of our efforts across the work that we do within the jobs that currently exist. And so how will that happen? Well, it's important to understand that technology substitutes for human effort in some tasks, but complements us in others. So there's going to become, in the near future, increased returns to being a question asker, to being a problem solver. So, going back to this slide on machine learning's influence in the medical field, we actually saw this in an earlier presentation, the idea that, these algorithms are getting better and better at recognizing retinopathy in an image. Machine learning, what it is, it's the ability to recognize patterns or decipher correlations in unstructured data. It's a very powerful tool, but where we decide to point that tool, the questions that we want to ask about it, that's still a fundamentally human task. It's a fundamentally human endeavor as to where we want to point that very powerful machine. I had the chance to meet the head of Google's AI health division, and he described the idea that, well, we discover that machine learning has this ability to identify retinopathy. We also understand the implications of the increasing incidence of type 2 diabetes in the US population. The natural place to point the machine learning algorithm is towards this issue. So, the idea of where to, what questions we want the advanced technology to ask, that is a fundamentally human endeavor. The other thing I want to say is that, of course, human beings, we're always going to have the comparative advantage of being human compared to a machine. So what are, these fundamentally human skills that I want to think about? I want to think about the social skills, the ability to collaborate, to communicate, both verbally and non-verbally, empathy, emotional intelligence. While we've seen the growth in employment of cognitive occupations. What a really nice paper by David Deming points out is that we haven't seen growth in all cognitive white-collar occupations equally. The growth has been strongest in occupations that require both cognitive and social skills. So that's this phenomenon that certain occupations are growing, some are shrinking. The cognitive and social skill occupations, those are the ones that are growing. And in work that I've done with Matthias Cortez and Nir Haimovich has been to think about, well, what about this shifting, task demand within occupations? What's true is that over time, in the past 40 years, is the occupations that increasingly require, occupations are increasingly demanding social skill ability. And those are the ones that happens to be true, especially strong at the top of the pay distribution. So again, just to think about this increasing importance of social skills, this is going to be true throughout the employment distribution at the very, very top end. You see here some anecdotes about the increasing importance of social skills in doctors and physicians, in executives, in kind of more middle-paying occupations. This is a nice piece that I pulled from Wired magazine. It talks about a robot that's entering into the nursing field. But if you read the text, Tug is a robot that works in a hospital setting. It can't talk philosophy with you, but what it could do then is potentially, and what it is being used for, is being used to deliver medicine to patients in the hospital rooms. So what that allows the nursing field to do then is to, offload that relatively mundane task and hopefully, shift emphasis on its more human tasks. For instance, comforting and speaking with and communicating with the patients that are in the hospital. This is what technological progress allows us to do if we don't simply think about it as taking away work. We can think about it as changing the nature of a job. And then the other thing to note, of course, and this is taken from, again, from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, these are the top 10 fastest growing occupations that the Bureau of Labor Statistics forecasts over the next 10 years. And aside from, solar panel installers and wind turbine service technicians, you'll see, home health aides, personal care aides, physician assistants, nurse practitioners. These are all fundamentally human interactive occupations, and this is where the growth is forecasted according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much. And
yeah, thank you very much, and great pleasure to be here this afternoon with you for this exciting conference. I wanted to give you a bit of an international perspective, working for the International Labour Organization, who actually incidentally celebrates its 100th-year anniversary this year. So I wanted to show you a bit to what extent some of the issues that we talked about this today are also translating into other countries outside, even outside the developed world. And what that really means in terms of what's at stake, what does it mean in terms of the consequences that we face on some of the economic and social issues, but also what kind of policies we might want to think and consider, especially the international side of these policy issues that we will see later on important. Before I do that, though, I wanted to show you one quote, which I think is something that we haven't really talked much about this, and which really ties in very neatly with what Henry was mentioning just before. Instead, that the lack of energy and energy efficiency of computing. Actually, computers are extremely inefficient in comparison to human brain when it comes down to its energy use. This is a quote from Chris Mooses, an AI expert from Germany. He developed this company Argo in the 1990s and still continues to this day to develop AI routines, and he has this really nice example saying that you actually just need a slice of bread to feed your brain, where a computer has an enormous amount of energy consumption that you need to run even simple routines. Just to give you an example, the US currently spends 6% of its electricity on computing devices. And some other news you might have heard about is that Microsoft is currently experimenting putting cloud computers into deep sea water to cool them down. And this has something, it's a deep physical reasons for that silicon-based computing devices are just so inefficient. The one thing that they're really good at is kind of crunching numbers, enormous amount of numbers. We are basically, our brains are made for small sample size predictions, whereas computers can crunch this enormous amount of data, which we never can. And I think that it's important to keep this in mind because it explains to a certain extent where computers have comparative advantage. So they actually don't have absolute advantages, and so all this whole fear about we all will lose our jobs is misplaced. They have comparative advantages, and the question is then exactly how do these comparative advantages play out in the future. So you have seen these examples, we've talked about them already, but I think it's interesting to group some of these examples into what economists like to differentiate between whether a technological change is labor saving, capital saving, or factor enhancing. So basically meaning that do you need to replace jobs, do you displace jobs, do you displace the machines or upgrade them, or do you actually make everybody working more efficiently together as machines? And if you do that, you see that, so the first thing is these labor-saving technologies like autonomous cars and smart machines, automation, etc. These are technologies that will use enormous amount of energy to be ready. Autonomous cars, in my view, is not unlikely to come anytime soon. Simply because the technology is required to kind of be able to identify a dark-suited woman in the middle of the night when it's raining on the side of the road, not to run her over. It's something which is really complicated to do from a technological point of view. Whereas for humans, it's totally easy. Well, maybe not totally, but it is relatively easy to do that. So in this sense, this is probably the least likely, or where computers have the least comparative advantage to replace humans. Then what we have just heard about AI in healthcare, AI in research, actually, we are all working here in the research area. Having AI-driven tools to make you more effective, that doesn't replace you. That just makes you more efficient in what you're doing. And the computers that you're using will become just a better tool at your task. And from an international perspective, what is really something which will enormously progress labor markets outside the advanced economies is expert systems in agriculture. We already see some examples. In Tunisia, for instance, there's a collaboration between a university and farmers in Tunisia to actually help them to better make use of the scarce resources that they have. Google is, for those of you who might know this, Google has recently just opened an AI center in Accra in Ghana exactly for the same reasons, because they want to deploy some of these expert technologies in low-income countries to make use of this data and to help them to become more efficient. But one example where I think where we've seen the biggest increase in terms of its impact, or the biggest impact in the future, is everything that relates to platform management and platform and network management. So online platform, we have already heard before about the different gig platforms that exist. But what is interesting is the network management is something which can enormously increase productivity, and that's really something where human beings have no comparative advantage, and where human beings actually don't they don't do these time of tasks. One example is, for instance, smart cities, where city management tries to evolve smart mobility systems, very integrated intermodal mobility systems, where you try to basically identify what's the fastest way to go from A to B using different types of different modes of transportation. Google claims that they have actually used AI to improve the electricity management and reduce the electricity consumption by 20%. This is something that no human being is currently doing and can do, because it's just so much data that you need to have. But it has a flip side, which is it actually creates enormous gains, enormous returns of technology for those who own this technology. And that's exactly the point I wanted to get at, which is to say that we actually won't see a rise in unemployment. What we'll see is a further rise in inequality. So this is just, if there's one chart you want to retain, is this one. This is an average for 12 OECD countries, where I basically just plotted the fall in computer storage cost over the last 25 years against a change in job destruction rates, which is this red line, and an increase in Gini measured inequality. Yeah? And you see, so this is job destruction, this is not unemployment. And you see that the job destruction rates, so the number of jobs actually being displaced, if you want, has been falling in OECD countries over the last 25 years, alongside the dramatic fall in computer storage costs. Huh? So you see that, if anything, there's basically either no relation, or computers have made jobs more stable, if you want, which is not the conclusion I would want to draw from this chart, but clearly there's no impact on computer storage cost on a rise in displacement. On the other hand, what has happened, or what was coincidentally happened, was the increase in inequality. And I do believe that this is going to continue in the future, and we see actually that's playing out not only in OECD countries, in other countries. What would be important, however, is to kind of disentangle a bit what is driving this inequality forces. And I see four type of forces that are shifting this, or that are increasing the inequality. One is basically, and we touched upon earlier, and I mentioned this in relationship to the capital saving part of it. Capital saving also means that new technological devices are complementary to high skills. So that means that you get a premium by being capable of using these devices, combined with the fact that over the next 25, 30 years, we see a continuous decline in the labor force. That means that we have a rising demand for skills, or at least a rising demand for those people who are capable of using these devices. And that is playing out in most parts of the countries, except from those where actually these technologies are not widespread, which is mostly in Africa and some part of Central and South America. The other thing is something that Henry also already alluded on, and unfortunately it's a bit small, but you get the gist of it, which is this job polarization effect. And I think what I wanted to show, especially with this chart, is that this is not something specific to the to the US or even to OECD countries. So these there's four panels for different levels of income development. Which is basically the high income countries on the left, the low income in the middle, and then there's the upper middle income countries to the right. All four categories, except from the one to the second to the right, are observing this type of job polarization. Even though this kind of artificial intelligence or smart machines is probably something that is only happening for the moment, at least mostly in the advanced economies. So apparently this job polarization issue is really it's a general trend. It's not nothing that's not something that's specific to OECD countries. And so we are likely to see this going forward in the future, which obvious consequences for especially low and lower middle income countries to develop their middle class. I think that's a key aspect that we need to keep in mind, that there might be actually a challenge for these countries to develop a strong rising middle class that will help these countries to develop further. A particular point, and I think that is really specific to artificial intelligence, is the fact that the gains of technological progress, as I mentioned before, the efficiency gains from, for instance, network management and online platforms, are really concentrated among a small number of companies. This is from an OECD study that was published in 2015. The IMF has recently done a similar study for advanced economies, where they widened a bit the time horizon. But overall, what they're saying is basically the top tier of the company segment are the ones that are getting all the benefits. The rest of it are either too slow to adopt, or they just can't manage to get these things. And that has consequences not only for the company profitability, but also for the wages that people are getting. So there is clearly an issue here that somehow the concentration of these gains is too small to kind of lift all boats. And that's something that has profound consequences, obviously, for inequality, but also profound consequences for the growth of the economy, this growth of aggregate demand, the push to kind of having broader productivity gains across the board. And then a last point, which I think it's important to keep in mind, and which is a bit tricky in a sense that it's really, you need to get back into your microeconomics 101, is the idea of that these AI tools really allow third-degree price discrimination. You really can identify the exact consumer, the exact type of preparedness to pay for a certain product. Now, in principle, these things are useful to expand the market. I mean, third degree price discrimination is not necessarily bad, but often if it's based on biased data, it can create huge inequalities. And if, for those of you who have read the press carefully, Amazon recently retired some of their hiring tools based on AI because of the fact that this was actually replicating biases against hiring women. And so obviously that is something you want to prevent at all costs, but you don't actually know in the beginning really what kind of biases you're replicating. So the question is, can we actually identify AI tools that help to automatically rectify these biases? And mathematicians are working on this, but for the moment, this is really just kind of music for the future. It's not currently happening simply because we rely too much on historical data that have this type of biases. So I should add one caveat to that. So I've talked a lot about that these new technologies might actually be more relevant for, might push inequality more, that they will destroy jobs. That is true for advanced economies. Unfortunately, for developing countries, the past waves of robotization seem to have particularly been devastating for employment. So this is just from another study that we did, where we kind of looked at the impact of robotization on employment in different parts of the world. And I just want to highlight these two numbers for in bold red here. And you can see that the estimated effects of robotization on developed economies is much smaller than in developing countries, partly because of the fact that these new technologies that are introduced in developing worlds are basically inadequate in terms of their labor market conditions. Often what companies need to do in developing countries, if they are part of a supply chain, they basically need to use technologies that are inefficient from the point of view of labor and wages that are in developing countries, but they're required to do that if they want to be part of this supply chain for quality issues, for issues of supply chain management, etc. So there's an issue there that robotization, at least in developing countries, might have an additional effect not only on inequality but also on job destruction. So let me just go quickly to some policy conclusion. One we have talked about it, and this is actually, I think just replicated a chart that Susan already showed you before, but I think I wanted to emphasize the social and emotional skills aspect to it. This is basically taken from a McKinsey study where they anticipate what are the changes in working hours according to different types of skills. And again, the technological skills come out very strongly here, but the other aspect that is really relevant in this chart is the importance of social and emotional skills. And when you think about, again, the example of the medical industry and medical services is quite relevant. Yeah. Eric Topol had recently published a book on deep medicine where he basically describes all the new technological advances to help physicians and doctors to become more effective. So these are capital-saving technologies which basically allow you to spend more time with your patients. But if you don't have that skill, if you don't have these kind of social and emotional skills because you're not properly prepared for that, you are actually ending up as becoming a really bad doctor. And so this is the kind of skills that you really know, and something that you can, that's almost like a lifelong skill in itself. If you have good social emotional skills that you learn when you're young, these are skills that will stay with you for the rest of your life. That's not something that you need to renew all the time. And so I think that's important that we kind of spend more emphasis in our education system on this type of skills. So one other thing is that what's interesting with these digital technologies, they have an international dimension to it, in a sense that you can actually provide services in one country for another country. Often that involves that you're not being taxed in the country where you actually provide the services, and that creates enormous imbalances in terms of where fiscal revenues are being generated. And nevertheless, countries still have this need for revenues to kind of finance their social protection system, etc. So there is a question of, do we need to move to a new form of digital taxation? There is ongoing discussions. Actually, the OECD just today published guidelines on some 10 ideas about how to regulate or how to move forward in terms of artificial intelligence. This is part of this idea. The other idea is that a lot of input that goes into these digital technologies is data that's basically provided for free, and in a sense, it's a wealth that comes out of the country as an economy that's not properly valued. One way of getting back that value and one way of kind of leveraging that possibility is creating some type of investment into these big tech companies. Just back on the envelope calculation for the US, if the US had invested 0.1% of GDP in Apple shares in 1999, they would now have 2% of capital valuation. So an enormous gain of a capital valuation gain that would generate out of it. And it's not a fanciful idea. I mean, you have an Alaska Permanent Fund, so you can easily extend this same type of idea to this type of industries because of this kind of wealth that is generated, which is almost like a public good. I've mentioned some other ideas, especially when it comes to the online platforms. There is currently some discussion on collective bargaining institutions that need to develop to help better sharing the gains that are there. These are again fancy. These are new ideas that need to be implemented, and it requires, to a certain extent, that social partners are ready to move forward in implementing them. One particular issue is and I think comes back to this data ownership, is maintaining the level playing field. I think there's currently, at least in this country, is a large debate about breaking Facebook and Google into its parts. I don't think that's a good idea. I think what's a better idea is to ensure data portability, that people have the contestability of these markets, that people can move their data to a new platform provider. Maybe another, that is a more kind of a fancy idea, but in California at least it's being discussed, is treat data as labor and actually creating some kind of data ownership to your private data, so that you actually can track and value the data and get some returns on the information that you provide over the internet. And then, I mean, one point that we kind of touched upon very quickly this morning was maintaining a conducive IPR regime. There are some issues in intellectual property rights where actually some of these intellectual property rights are being used to shun out competitors, not so much for the sake of for better innovation, but rather to kind of limit the competition on the market. And the last point in terms of public policy issues is obviously all this only works in an environment where you have properly regulated and properly functioning states that help to develop these ideas. Some of the possibilities, for instance, and Estonia is in the sense a front runner in implementing some of these ideas, is e-citizenship. So move everything on the market. Governments are really good through public procurement systems to actually promote some of these things to kind of have a wider impact on the economy. Another one is creating actually better digital infrastructure. And I mentioned before the challenge for autonomous vehicles. What you can have is you have a properly closed system. You can actually play with some of these technologies much better. Switzerland is currently trying to operate a tunnel between major cities to actually transport goods and get them away from the public road system into a tunnel system, so that it actually helps. First of all, it helps the supply chain, and second, it helps also to avoid traffic jams that in Switzerland are actually quite common. So just to conclude, I think that what is really important to recognize is these new technologies have enormous capacity to transform markets beyond even advanced economies. A lot of these things are currently being discussed in developing countries and can create enormous productivity gains. But it requires, to a certain extent, that policymakers are ready to adopt to these technologies and to prepare the economies for this, both in terms of the education system, but also in terms of who is gaining, how are these gains are being properly shared across the economy. Thank you very much, and if you want to know more about it, we have some publication on this. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ekkehard. And without transition, Katharine will talk more about the transformation of labor market arrangements.
Great. So we've heard quite a bit today about the way that that technology is affecting and is likely to affect the kind of work that people do. What I want to talk just briefly about is some of the ways in which changes in technology might be helping to shape the way that work is structured. I'm going to be focusing on what I'll refer to as contract work, by which I mean individuals who work as independent contractors or people who work for contract firms that provide services to other businesses. So that would include the growth of the gig economy, these jobs mediated through online platforms, which at this point are modest in scale, but as we've heard already, have experienced very rapid growth. But also what David Weil has referred to as the fissuring of the workplace, and I'll have a little more to say about that. I'm interested in two questions. So what we can say about these changes in work structure and what's driving them, and then what issues these changes raise for policy. So let me start by just talking a little bit about the things that influence the way that work is structured, by which I mean specifically whether firms decide to have the work performed in-house by their own employees or to be shifted outside of the firm to independent contractors or contract firms. This is it's actually a question about what the boundary of the firm is and what determines that. It's a very old question in economics dating back at least to Coase in 1937. There's a lot of reasons to have work inside the firm. I'm going to focus mainly on the reasons to move work outside of the firm. A firm might want to contract work out because if you have people working in the same internal labor market, that constrains relative pay, and if you want to have more flexibility to set pay lower for certain workers or higher for certain workers, you might want to contract that work out. There's a lot of obligations that fall on employers who have employees. If you have work done by contract workers, you don't incur those same liabilities. That might be a reason for wanting to contract work out. If your demand for your products and services is volatile, you might want to buffer yourself against having to hire people and lay them off. You might want to take advantage of specialized expertise that an independent contractor or contract firm has. So there's a lot of reasons why you might want to contract work out as a firm. In the context of our discussion today, it seems to me that there's a lot of evidence that some of the new technologies that have come online over the past decade or so have lowered the costs of transacting with individuals or firms that you're contracting with. These online platforms can lower the search and information costs of finding workers. If there's a well-developed marketplace where you can go out and find people, that may reduce your bargaining and decision costs. If new technology makes it easier for you to monitor what somebody who's not physically there is doing, that may lower those costs. So there's a lot of reason to think that these transaction costs are falling, and that may change what it makes sense for a firm to do about contracting out versus producing in-house. It's not obvious whether this is going to be good or bad for workers. There's been a lot of concern focused on the idea that these developments are depressing wages and shifting risk from firms to workers. But it's also true that if you look at Bureau of Labor Statistics data, about 4 out of 5 people who work as independent contractors say they prefer it to the alternative. So we'll come back to that. So what do data tell us about contract work? Unfortunately, they tell us less than we would like. I was very happy to hear Governor Carstens at lunch today talk about the importance of investing in our data infrastructure, and this is a place where I think we could use some investment. A lot of the data we have about the labor market come from the current population survey and other household surveys. They are just not well suited to tracking these developments. I'm not going to go into the details of this here, but there is accumulating evidence, I think, that the current population survey misses or mischaracterizes some non-employee work. People don't report it. They don't think of it as a job. They don't understand that they're really not an employee. And so I think we're missing part of the picture there. And these surveys are just not set up at all to identify this phenomenon of workplace fissuring, larger firms contracting more stuff out to smaller firms. There's some things that we can learn from administrative data, and I'll show you a chart or two about that pick up the fact that there has been growth in this contract work. Unincorporated self-employment is where it's showing up that the household survey data don't capture. And then there's some things that we can learn from looking at business data, but we're really sort of looking for the footprints of this activity rather than doing a really good job of measuring it. So let me just elaborate on what I was saying just now about the household surveys not doing a very good job of picking up this contract work. This is a chart that shows you different measures of the trend over the period from 1996 through 2016 in the self-employment rate, the share of people working in the labor market who in the household surveys say they're unemployed, they're self-employed. There's different ways you can measure it, but they're all pretty low and they're falling. That doesn't conform very well to what we're hearing anecdotally. These black lines are different measures of the share of the workforce that has self-employment activity coming from administrative data. The message I take away from this is that the household surveys are just missing some important stuff. We can delve into this a little bit more, some work with colleagues that I've done. We've actually taken records from the household survey, the current population survey, and linked them up for the same people to their tax records. And what we see the same thing. These three lines here, the dotted blue line is the share of people who in our linked data are reporting self-employment income both in the household survey and in the tax records. They're agreeing, yay. There's some people who say they have self-employment income in the household survey data, but it's not showing up in tax data. We've always known that there's underreporting in the tax data. The thing that's surprising to me is that black line, which is the people who are reporting to the IRS that they have self-employment income, but it's not showing up in the household survey data. So that's just sort of reinforcing that we're missing some stuff. There's another place where we can look to get some clues about what's going on with this contract work, and that's the data that the Census Bureau puts together on non-employers. These are people who have businesses where they report business income, but they don't have any employees. This is where these gig employees should be showing up if they're starting to have self-employment income. So we've done some work looking at some colleagues and I looking at where we're seeing growth in these non-employer businesses. We looked at, over the period from 2010 to 2016, the percentage growth in all of these industries. That bar over there on the left is the ground passenger transportation industry. We've heard some about this already. That's Uber and Lyft is what's showing up there. But we're not seeing clear evidence of rapid growth in these number of non-employers in any of these other industries. That this chart just shows that growth really started taking off about the point that Uber and Lyft were entering the market. We've done some digging into what's going on with the people entering this industry. I'm going to skip over the next few slides in the interest of time. You've seen one of these before already. We have been doing some looking at how this has been changing the composition of the industry. Let me just tell you how to read this chart, and then I'll go very quickly through the next ones. This is showing you, the chart on the left, the percent female in the taxi and limousine industry, which is basically where Uber and Lyft are entering. These are these non-employer businesses, these independent contractors. The dark blue bar is the share of this industry that was female in 2011. The people who were there in 2010 and were still there in 2011. The light blue bars are in the following years, how that the people entering the industry, what their composition was. And so you can see that what the entry of Uber and Lyft has done is brought in a lot more women to this industry. Fewer of the drivers in the industry are non-white. Fewer of the drivers are foreign-born. The gross receipts that these drivers are earning is a lot less. It's always been the case that a new entrant earned less than an incumbent, but it's really been falling. Their net receipts have fallen even more. So you're bringing in a very different set of people who are working, we infer, more part-time, And a lot of them are combining doing this with doing something else. So this is very consistent with the story that Erica was telling earlier. We've done some further looking on how the entry of Uber has affected local labor markets, if you will. A big question is what it's been doing to the incumbent taxi drivers. And because we have data that we can see whether people were in the industry before and then what happens to them, we're able to look at that. We find that the entry of Uber into a local labor market, sort of as a proxy for the entry of these ride-sharing apps more generally, tends to push incumbent drivers out. They're more likely to leave the industry, and if they stay, their earnings are depressed. So there's those effects. As a lot of people have talked about technological changes, and there's winners and losers, and I think we're seeing some losers here. But we're also seeing, we think, evidence of some benefits for the people who are entering. There are a number of studies that have found that the opportunity to do this ride-sharing work and lets people smooth their income when they have fluctuations in income from other sources. We also find some evidence in work we're doing that the availability of these ride-sharing apps in your local labor market creates a new option for people who are displaced through a mass layoff. There's a sharp increase in the probability that they take up that kind of work, which is sort of consistent with the income smoothing story. So we know something about these independent contractors. I don't know how much we can generalize from the ride-sharing example, but it at least tells us something. What's harder to get information on, and is probably more important, is this what's going on in terms of this fissuring of the workforce. And the thing that I'm talking about specifically is, instead of having a big internal labor market with employees doing all the work that a firm needs to get done, the firm instead may turn to contracting some of this stuff out. There is evidence that it's related to some extent to technology. There's a really interesting study by Teresa Fort at Dartmouth who has found that in manufacturing, that adoption of computer-aided design and computer-aided manufacturing technologies is associated with a significant increase in the propensity of the firm to contract out, and that's particularly true in industries where production specifications are easier to codify electronically so that you can shift the work outside the firm. David Weil has talked a lot, though his evidence is more anecdotal, I guess, about the effect that the development of sophisticated logistical and monitoring systems have had on facilitating contracting out of work in a whole variety of industries. In this case, it's partly about being able to offer lower wages and benefits to the firms of the contract employees than their own employees would get, but you couldn't do it without the supporting technology. And then one last piece of evidence is that we've seen increasing segregation of establishments by occupation into more high-skill occupations and low-skill occupations, which again seems to be related to taking advantage of the opportunity to differentiate earnings more. So, what does this imply? There's a lot of issues that we could talk about in terms of policy. I want to just briefly mention two that I think relate to this question of how work is structured. So one set of issues relates to our labor market laws and regulations, which really were designed for a world in which people had employees. So if you're an employee, you have protection from laws against discrimination in employment, you're covered by unemployment insurance, you're covered by workers' compensation. If you're an independent contractor, none of that applies to you in the same way. And I think if we're really moving to a world where more people are working as independent contractors, we may need to rethink some of that. That's point one. And then my final point concerns the fissuring of the workplace. If you work for a contract firm that's providing services to another bigger firm, you are an employee. So that first set of issues that I mentioned doesn't apply to you directly. But there is an issue, I think, and again, David Weil has talked a lot about this, about when you have a workplace where there's people working for a big firm and then people working on site for a contractor firm, the responsibility for who's going to ensure that the working conditions are safe and that regulations are adhered to and so on becomes very diffuse. And I think, again, we may need to rethink that. And then a final point in the same vein, in the good old days, when we had big firms with internal labor markets, people could come into the internal labor market and plan to move, work on it, moving up. A firm might have had more incentive to train people because they actually were going to be there in those higher level jobs potentially down the road. If that's breaking down, and to some extent I think there is evidence that it is, I think we may need to be rethinking how we create opportunities for career mobility for these workers if it's not going to be occurring within the internal labor market. So let me stop there.
Very good. Excellent. Thank you very much. So our three panelists cover a lot of ground and raised a lot of very exciting issues and questions here. So I'm going to open it up directly to the audience to see if there are any questions. Yep.
I just want to, Catherine, I loved your presentation. I am a reporter with The Street. I'm the senior global finance and economics correspondent for The Street. My name's Brad Cowan. I also work remotely and independently, so I have some thoughts on the topic. And I think it ties directly into, the issue, which is the number one issue facing the Federal Reserve right now, which is why do we have such a low unemployment rate and like zero inflation practically? And I think this issue of contract workers plays into it because if you really think about the value that a worker provides in exchange for some sort of value in return, and when you agree to work for somebody, there's negative value that you're not compensated for, and that could be your commute time, that could be your stress, that could be your time you waste talking to people that you don't really care that much about, right? I mean, working independently, I have learned how, once I figured out how to be productive as with not having a boss, which was a struggle, once you learn that, you realize you can be so much more productive than you are at the office. You can get a lot more done. And you don't have to spend an hour each way on the New York City subway. There have been recent minutes from the Federal Reserve meetings where they have talked about employers finding the labor market so tight.
So we just have like a few minutes left for
Okay,
questions. So
that the labor markets are so tight that they're offering non-wage forms of compensation, including flexible work arrangements. And I think a similar concept applies to contract workers. They receive a better quality of life in exchange for lower pay. Okay, this one's here's a question.
All right.
Okay. Anyways, just my 2 cents on yours, Catherine. But a question. The topic, Rob has raised the question, technology, what is the role of technology in keeping inflation low at a time when we have full employment? And any of you guys, I'd love to hear your answers on that.
Thank you. I guess, Catherine, you want to start with the
Thank you.
first part of the question, and then we'll move to
So I wasn't sure there was a question about the contract workers, but I think just sort of a comment in response to what you were saying. I think it's probably true that it matters a lot if you're a contract worker, what kind of deal you're getting if you're a high-skilled person versus a low-skilled person. And I think, contracting out, being an independent contractor looks very different if you're a professional providing, specialized services in short supply and so on than if you're a contract worker who's delivering packages for a larger company on an hourly or at a 1099 sort of basis.
Yeah, just briefly on the issue of where's the wage inflation given the tightness of the U.S. labor market. I think this is a perplexing phenomenon that we're observing. I think it was in Jackson Hole, I think last summer, where there was proposed the idea that it could have something to do with market concentration, and to the extent that technological advance, or at least the current wave of technological advance, is leading to greater concentration within industries. Whether that does put downward pressure on price and wage inflation, I think that's an interesting hypothesis. I'm certainly open to further investigation.
I want to put a plug for 2 of the sessions tomorrow where we'll talk about the effects on productivity and implicitly on price adjustment as well. So we'll have a more complete answers tomorrow, I guess, on that. Any other question? Jill?
Yeah, I had a question. I felt like throughout the presentation there was sort of an assumption that technology means computer science, it means AI. But yet I felt like also in one of the charts there was some reference to wind, and solar as being kind of, I forget whose presentation it was, sort of highlighting that. I guess I was curious, when you think about computer science, you've got the problems of cybersecurity that's already been talked about. You have the issues in terms of data privacy, which were alluded to, and which one suspects will become more kind of front burner in terms of public policy issues. And then you also have the issue around software liability that hasn't even really come up here, but is kind of relevant too. These are all things that you would think in terms of IT would be an issue in terms of that just being the sole driver of technological change. Do you see any role for biology, biological sciences, or even climate adaptation? Thanks.
Well, I mean, maybe I can give you try an answer to that. I mean, what in my presentation, I'm just concentrated on artificial intelligence, but what you're describing is absolutely correct. Innovation is not necessarily restricted to that. And I mean, especially in biological system, and there's enormous research going on currently to genetic engineering, genetic modification. I mean, these are all new developments that are out there, and that might actually have a much stronger effect, especially on some of the issues I touched upon in terms of agricultural productivity in low-income countries, etc. I think these are key issues that we need to follow up. I still would want to kind of insist on the fact that, and I think that kind of answers also a bit the previous question, is that a lot of these gains are currently concentrated on certain firms, certain industries, and the concentration of technological gains, the benefits, this creates concentration of income and concentration of wealth, which then doesn't necessarily show up in this kind of broad-based sharing and benefits and wage increases. And I think that is part of the answer to why we don't see more of these type of benefits, more of a more broad-based increase in living standards, both within advanced economies, but also across the world. And I think that is really an issue that we need to tackle with some public policies.
One last minute question. No, so I guess thank you very much to the panel, and please join me in thanking them all of them. So that was a fascinating panel that brought up a lot of issues. We're now moving to the receptions that will take place outside of this room, and